Summary of The End of the Affair by Greene. The main character and narrator of The End of the Affair is Maurice Bendrix. He says that this story is a record of hate far more than of love. On a cold and rainy night, Bendrix leaves his apartment to go to a bar near his home. He sees Henry Miles standing alone in the rain, and even though he doesn't like Henry, Bendrix goes up to him and says hello. Henry, on the other hand, seems excited to see Bendrix. He says that he hasn't seen Bendrix in a long time and implies that Bendrix is the only one who hates him. Bendrix asks Henry about his wife Sarah because he thinks it would be strange not to. Bendrix thinks to himself that he would be thrilled to hear that Sarah is sad and sick, because knowing that she is suffering would make his own pain less. Henry tells Bendrix that Sarah has left for the night. Bendrix asks Henry to join him for a drink at the pub. Henry agrees, and the two of them walk to the closest one. Bendrix and Henry each order a rum at the pub, and Bendrix thinks back over the years to remember how he met Henry and Sarah in the first place. In 1939, Bendrix was writing a book about a person who worked for the government. He took Sarah out to lunch so he could ask her about Henry, who worked at the Ministry of Home Security as a secretary. They became friends after that. At some point, Bendrix told Sarah about his book and how he was using Henry as inspiration for a silly character in the book that was meant to be funny. Sarah, who was very loyal to Henry, hated the book right away. From then on, Bendrix would make Sarah cry by asking her questions about Henry on purpose. Henry tells Bendrix that he is worried about Sarah in the present. Henry tells Bendrix that he doesn't think Sarah is sick when Bendrix asks. Henry asks Bendrix to come back to his house so they can talk in a quieter, more private place. Henry shows Bendrix a letter with a suggestion for a discreet private detective. This shows that he has doubts about Sarah's faithfulness and has thought about hiring a private detective to follow her. When Bendrix offers to go to Mr. Savage himself to save Henry from being embarrassed, Henry says it can't be done and burns the paper with Mr. Savage's address on it. At that moment, they hear Sarah come in. Henry tells Sarah that she will get a cold and die because she is completely soaked from the rain. In an aside, Bendrix wonders if their feelings of distrust and hate would have been different if they had known how true Henry's comment was. Several days later, Bendrix goes to see Mr. Savage. During their conversation, Bendrix tells Mr. Savage that he and Sarah had an affair, but that they haven't been together since June 1944, which is about 2 years before the present. When Mr. Savage is surprised, Bendrix asks, "Can't one love or hate for that long?" Mr. Savage says that anger is the sign of true love, so he makes plans for a man to follow Sarah and tell Bendrix every week where she is. Sarah calls Bendrix when she gets home and asks him to meet her for lunch because she wants to talk to him about something. Bendrix agrees. At a place called Rules, which they used to go to together, Sarah tells Bendrix that she worries Henry is lonely and asks him to talk to him every once in a while. Bendrix is surprised to hear that Henry is lonely even though Sarah is there. Sarah tells Bendrix that Henry hasn't really noticed her in years. Bendrix pays the bill, and as they leave the restaurant, they stop at the vent where they had their first kiss years ago. Bendrix moves towards Sarah as if he's going to kiss her again, but she starts coughing again. This is the second time she's done this during the afternoon they've been spending together. Bendrix tells her in a cold way that she needs to see a doctor about her cough, and they go their separate ways. Bendrix thinks about his old relationship with Sarah when he gets home. Bendrix was able to keep up with his usual writing plan for most of the time they were together. Bendrix found it hard to write anything once he understood how much they fought and that their relationship was over. Bendrix is thinking when his landlord's wife tells him that Mr. Parkus wants to talk to him. When Mr. Parkus walks in, he says, "I'm Mr. Savage's man." He is there to give the Bendrix a first report. Bendrix realizes as he reads the report that Mr. Parkus had been watching him and Sarah eat lunch, even though Mr. Parkus didn't know Bendrix. When Bendrix tells him about it, Mr. Parkus feels embarrassed and worries about what he'll tell his son, Lance, about it. Bendrix tells Mr. Parkus to just tell Lance a different story to explain the mistake, but Mr. Parkus insists on telling Lance the truth. As Mr. Parkus walks away, Bendrix understands that his interest in Mr. Parkus's problem for a short time kept him from thinking about himself and Sarah. Bendrix thinks about the first days of his relationship with Sarah when he is by himself. Not long after they had kissed for the first time, they went to see a movie together that was based on one of Bendrix's stories. After that, they went to Rules for lunch, and then they decided to go to a hotel together. After their first awkward tryst, they went back to Sarah's house and held each other while Henry worked in another room. When Bendrix said that Henry could walk in on them without notice, Sarah told him there was a squeaky stair that would let Henry know he was there. Later, when Sarah was walking Bendrix to the door, she told him that she should call him instead of him calling her. Bendrix realized that Sarah had done other things in the past because she had thought ahead. Soon after, Bendrix went to Sarah's house to see her while Henry was sick in bed, and they had sex on the floor of her room. When Sarah went into her climax, she told Bendrix that Henry had never been able to make her do that in the 10 years they had been together. This showed why Sarah was having affairs outside of her marriage. She needed sexual pleasure and fulfillment. Back in the present, Mr. Parkus tells Bendrix that he followed Sarah to a private home on Cedar Road, where she seems to spend a lot of time. Mr. Parkus also sends a piece of a love letter that Sarah wrote, "I want to give up everything and everyone except you. It's not clear who you is." Bendrix gets more and more jealous after reading the letter, and he remembers all the times he and Sarah fought about how jealous he was when they were together. A few days later, Bendrix hears that Sarah went back to the same home on Cedar Road. Bendrix sees this as proof that Sarah is seeing someone else, so he writes to Henry and tells him he has some important information to share. A short time later, when he and Henry meet for lunch, Bendrix tells Henry that he hired Mr. Savage and, as a result, has proof that Sarah is having an affair. When Bendrix tries to give Henry the reports and proof, Henry throws them into the fire instead of reading them, and then he storms out of the building. When Bendrix finds Henry, Henry asks him if he had an affair with Sarah too. Bendrix admits that they did and says that Sarah has affairs because Henry is a bore and a fool. Henry asks Bendrix why he and Sarah's affair stopped, and Bendrix tells him that it was because their love had reached its end. Bendrix thinks in private about how his affair with Sarah really ended. Their last night together was the same night that the V-1 bombs hit London for the first time in 1944, just before the end of World War II. When the air raid started, Bendrix and Sarah were in bed together. Bendrix got up to see if they needed to go to the bomb bunker in the basement. Shortly after Bendrix left the room, a bomb went off in his building and destroyed part of it. The blast broke almost all of the windows in Bendrix's house except for the stained glass window on his door. It also knocked him out. Sarah was scared by the blast, so she went to find Bendrix. She found his dead body stuck under a door. Sarah ran back to Bendrix's room, where she prayed to God in a way that wasn't like her. She told God that if he let Bendrix live, she would stop her affair and go back to her husband. Just then, Bendrix walked back into his room with only minor injuries, and Sarah left right away, even though Bendrix asked her to stay. Bendrix tried to call and write to Sarah after she left, but she had moved to the country with Henry, so he never saw or heard from her again for 2 years. Back in the present, Mr. Parkus has found out 2 important things. First, he knows that Richard Smythe is the name of the person Sarah is visiting. Most importantly, Mr. Parkus was able to take Sarah's diary, which he now gives to Bendrix. Bendrix reads in the diary about Sarah's promise to God and her spiritual battle afterward. Sarah had never cared much about whether or not God existed, but after the miracle of Bendrix coming back to life, she started to believe. Bendrix also finds out that Mr. Smythe is an atheist. Sarah had thought that Mr. Smythe could convince her not to believe in God so that she could break her promise and go back to Bendrix. Sarah's feelings about God and her desire to be with Bendrix change over the course of the book. Bendrix calls Sarah after reading this and tells her he's coming to get her, even though she asks him not to. Sarah, who is very sick, runs out into the rain to get away from Bendrix when he comes. Sarah stops at a church, which is where Bendrix finds her. He tells Sarah that he read her notebook. He tells Sarah to go back home and rest. Once she's better, they can run away together. Sarah, on the other hand, dies a few days later. Bendrix finds a letter Sarah wrote to him a few days before she died. In it, she tells him that she is married and believes in God, so she can't run away with him. This makes he angry, so he starts yelling at God for keeping him and Sarah apart. Since he has forgiven Sarah for what she did, Henry asks Bendrix to help him plan Sarah's funeral. Father Crompton, a Catholic priest, says that Sarah was interested in Catholicism, but Bendrix talks Henry out of giving Sarah a Catholic service. Sarah's mother, Mrs. Bertram, tells everyone at her funeral that Sarah was secretly baptized when she was a child. This adds to the idea that Sarah wasn't really an atheist. Bendrix, who calls himself an atheist, starts to struggle with a growing trust in God. Even though it hurts, he knows for sure that God exists because God was powerful enough to get Sarah to leave him. At the end, Bendrix asks God to leave him alone forever because love hurts too much.
About the author. Henry Graham Greene was the fourth of his parents, Charles Henry and Marion Raymond Greene's, 6 children.
When Greene was a young boy, he spent time at his uncle Sir Graham Greene's farm in Cambridgeshire. There, he learned to love to read. In 1910, Greene began going to the school where his father was the teacher. Greene had major bouts of depression from a young age, which led to him being sent away for psychoanalysis when he was 16 years old, in 1920. Later, Greene went to Oxford University and got a degree in history, but he was depressed and mostly kept to himself while he was there. After college, Greene worked as a writer and reviewer. He met his wife, Vivian Darrell Browning, when she wrote to the paper he worked for to correct something he had said about Catholicism.
Greene got to know Vivian and learned more about Catholicism over time.
In 1926, he decided to become a Catholic. The next year, he married Vivian, and they had 2 children together. Greene's first book, The Man Within, came out in 1929. After that, his career took off, but he still worked as a literary and movie reviewer for newspapers.
During World War II, Greene worked in Sierra Leone for England's MI6 and went everywhere for work.
Greene left his family in 1947, but because he was Catholic, he never divorced his wife. Instead, Greene moved away to be closer to his lover, Yvonne Cloetta. He stayed with her for the rest of his life. Greene died in 1991 in Vevey, Switzerland, from leukemia.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.